called the family curse her entire life. She never imagined her father would literally sacrifice her to one. But when the Shadow Prince claimed her as his bride, he saw what no mortal ever could. They whispered she was cursed from birth, the fat, useless daughter who brought shame to the noble house of Ravencrest. But when her own father traded her to the most feared demon prince in the Shadow Realm as payment for his debts, no one expected she would become the most powerful queen darkness had ever known. Some curses are worn on the outside, others carved into the soul, but the deadliest ones do both. In the obsidian towers of Ravencrest Manor, where gargoyles perched like silent judges and shadows moved with lives of their own, lived Lyraleth, a girl of 24 whose name meant Song of Light in the old tongue, though no light had touched her life since the day she was born. Her reflection in the scrying mirror that morning showed the same truth it had revealed for years: round cheeks that had never known hunger, a body that curved where noble ladies should be slender, and eyes the color of storm clouds, beautiful but always threatening rain. The mirror was enchanted to show only truth, which made it particularly cruel. "Still stuffing yourself with honey cakes, I see," came the ice-cold voice of her stepmother, Lady Morwen, from the doorway. The woman glided into the chamber like a wraith, her silver hair gleaming and her figure eternally preserved by blood magic, a stark contrast to Lyraleth's natural, abundant form. Lyraleth's hand froze halfway to her mouth, the half-eaten cake crumbling between her fingers. She hadn't even realized she was eating. Food had become her only comfort in this tower of judgment and whispered curses. But wait, this is where everything changes. "Your father wishes to see you in the blood chamber," Lady Morwen continued, her pale lips curving into what might have been a smile if it held any warmth. Immediately, the blood chamber. Lyraleth's stomach dropped. Nothing good ever happened in the blood chamber. It was where her father, Lord Aldrich Ravencrest, conducted his darkest business, where he made deals with entities that should never be summoned, where he'd sold pieces of his soul to maintain the family's power and wealth. And you still don't know the worst part. As Lyraleth made her way through the twisting corridors of Ravencrest Manor, portraits of her ancestors seemed to follow her with disapproving eyes. Each painting showed the same thing: generations of beautiful, slender Ravencrest women with their demon-touched husbands. Powerful, attractive, successful. She was the aberration, the stain on their perfect bloodline. Here's what nobody told her. The Ravencrest family had been bound by an ancient pact for 300 years. Every generation, they offered something precious to the Shadow Realm in exchange for power, wealth, and magical protection. Usually, it was gold, artifacts, or years of servitude. But Lord Aldrich had been greedy, too greedy. He'd borrowed power beyond his ability to repay. And now, the collectors had come calling. The door to the blood chamber stood before her, like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. Carved from black heartwood and inlaid with silver runes that hurt to look at directly, it radiated the kind of malevolent energy that made mortal souls recoil. But Lyraleth had grown up in this house of dark magic. She was used to things that would send normal people screaming. She pushed open the door. The chamber beyond was circular, with walls lined in books bound in leather that had never come from any earthly creature. Candles floated in midair, their flames burning green and blue, casting everything in an otherworldly light. In the center of the room stood a summoning circle, carved directly into the stone floor, its channels still dark with dried blood from previous rituals. Her father stood beside it, no longer the imposing figure she remembered from childhood. Lord Aldrich Ravencrest had aged decades in the past year, his once powerful frame now gaunt, his hair gone completely white. The cost of his magical dealings was written in every line on his face. But he wasn't alone. 3 figures stood within the summoning circle, and they were beautiful in the way that poisonous flowers are beautiful, lovely enough to draw you close, deadly enough to destroy you utterly. The tallest was clearly their leader. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with silver hair that moved like liquid mercury, and eyes the color of fresh blood. His skin was pale as moonlight, stretched over a frame that suggested both elegance and lethal strength. When he smiled, Lyraleth caught a glimpse of fangs that gleamed like polished ivory. Ah, his voice was like velvet, wrapped around a blade. The payment arrives. Lyraleth's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Father, Lord Aldrich, couldn't meet her eyes. Lyraleth, my dear, meet Prince Khaemwaset of the Shadow Realm, heir to the Obsidian Throne. His voice shook as he spoke. And your betrothed. The world tilted sideways. My what? The demon prince stepped forward, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. As he drew closer, Latino could see that his beauty was wrong somehow. Too perfect, too sharp, like a blade honed to deadly perfection. His gaze moved over her with the calculating interest of a buyer examining livestock. Yes, Prince Khaemwaset murmured, circling her slowly. She'll do nicely. I can feel the untapped power thrumming beneath her skin. Tell me, little mortal, what do you know of blood magic? Lyraleth's mouth opened and closed without sound. Blood magic. She knew it existed, had seen her father's books, heard whispered conversations, but she'd never. Nothing, her father answered for her. She's been kept innocent of such things, as requested. Innocent? The prince's laugh was like broken glass. Oh, she's far from innocent. Look closer, mortal lord. Your daughter carries the mark of old magic, deeper and darker than anything in your pitiful collection. What mark? What was he talking about? The marriage will be consummated during the blood moon, the prince continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than Lyraleth's fate. 3 days hence. I trust you can have her prepared by then. Marriage? Lyraleth finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I don't understand. What debt? What agreement? Her father finally looked at her, and she saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before. Shame, the family fortune, Lyraleth, our power, our position, our very lives. All of it was borrowed from the Shadow Realm. The debt has come due, and the interest. He swallowed hard. The interest is you. The room spun. Lyraleth reached for the wall to steady herself, but instead of cold stone, her hand met something warm and solid. She looked up to find herself staring into Prince Khaemwaset's crimson eyes. Don't look so terrified, little bride, he purred, his breath cool against her cheek. I have no intention of harming you. Quite the opposite. Actually, you see, you're far more valuable than your fool of a father realizes. His fingers traced the line of her jaw with surprising gentleness. Tell me, Lyraleth of Increst, have you ever wondered why you look nothing like the rest of your family? Why your magic feels different? Why every diet and potion your stepmother feeds you fails to change your natural form? How did he know about the potions? Because you're not entirely human, my dear. Your grandmother was one of us, a shadow fae who fell in love with a mortal and paid the ultimate price for it. The magic in your blood has been sleeping, waiting for someone who knows how to awaken it. Lady Morwen's sharp intake of breath echoed through the chamber. That's impossible. Lyraleth? Perfect, the prince finished, never taking his eyes off Lyraleth's face. Absolutely perfect. And that's when everything Lyraleth thought she knew about herself began to crumble. You see, Prince Khaemwaset continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper meant only for her ears. In our realm, power takes many forms. Your mortal world prizes the narrow and the sharp, but true magic, ancient magic, requires depth, substance, the ability to contain vast forces without breaking. His hand moved to rest over her heart, and Lyraleth felt something stir in her chest, something that had been sleeping her entire life. Your body isn't a flaw, little bride. It's a reservoir, built to hold more magic than any slender mortal frame could contain. When I awaken your true heritage, you'll understand why your ancestors chose this form, why every great sorceress in history carried power in curves that lesser minds couldn't appreciate. Could it be true? For a moment, just a moment, Lyraleth allowed herself to believe, to imagine that every cruel word, every disappointed look, every failed attempt to make herself smaller had been based on a lie. that she was exactly what she was supposed to be. But then reality crashed back. "This is insane," she said, pulling away from his touch. "You're talking about magic and bloodlines and tide. I don't even know you. I won't marry someone I've never met, demon prince or not." Prince Khaemwaset's smile widened, showing more of those gleaming fangs. "Brave girl, I do appreciate spirit in a bride." He turned to Lord Aldrich. "The contract is sealed. 3 days. Mortal. Don't disappoint me." The three shadow fae began to fade like smoke, but the prince's voice lingered. "And Lyraleth, backlight, where we're going, you won't need the trappings of your old life." Then they were gone, leaving behind only the scent of midnight roses and the promise of a wedding that would change everything. Lord Aldrich slumped into a chair, looking like he'd aged another decade in the span of minutes. "Lyraleth, don't." The word came out harder than she'd ever spoken to her father before. "Just don't." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Tell me one thing. If I refuse, if I run, what happens to the family?" Her father's silence was answer enough. "Right." Lyraleth straightened her shoulders, feeling something shift inside her, something that might have been the first stirring of the magic Prince Khaemwaset claimed ran in her veins. 3 days then. But as she walked back to her chambers, Lyraleth had no idea that her real story was just beginning. And in the shadow realm, Prince Khaemwaset smiled as he felt his bride's power pulse to life for the first time. Every fairy tale warns about accepting gifts from dark princes, but no one mentions what happens when you discover you are the gift. The next morning brought no relief from the nightmare her life had become. Lyraleth woke to find her chamber filled with gifts that definitely hadn't been there when she'd cried herself to sleep. Gowns of midnight silk that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, jewelry carved from black pearls and set with stones she couldn't identify, gems that pulsed with their own inner fire, perfumes in crystal bottles that smelled of night-blooming flowers and distant storms, and books. Dozens of books bound in leather, so fine it felt like silk, their pages filled with symbols that hurt her eyes to look at directly, but somehow made perfect sense. Blood magic for beginners, a history of the shadow realm, the care and feeding of demonic husbands. That last one made her snort with bitter laughter. At least Prince Khaemwaset had a sense of humor about the situation. But wait, there's something you need to know about these gifts. As Lyraleth reached for one of the books, her fingers began to tingle. Not unpleasantly, more like the sensation of coming in from bitter cold to a warm fire. The magic she'd felt stirring yesterday grew stronger, and suddenly she could read the strange symbols as easily as common script. The awakening of shadow fae blood requires a catalyst, typically strong emotion or proximity to one's fated mate. Once begun, the process cannot be stopped or reversed. The subject will experience increased magical sensitivity, enhanced physical capabilities, and gradual changes to their essential nature. "Gradual changes?" she whispered to the empty room.
"What kind of changes?"
The book seemed to answer her, pages fluttering open to a detailed illustration that made her heart stop. It showed a woman in 2 forms, before and after, magical awakening. The before woman was soft, round, entirely human. The after version was magnificent, still curved, still full-figured, but now her skin held an otherworldly luminescence. Her hair moved like it was underwater, and her eyes glowed with inner fire. Power radiated from every line of her body. The shadow fae form celebrates abundance in all things: magic, beauty, life force, and yes, physical presence. What mortals see as excess, we recognize as capacity. A knock at her door interrupted her reading. "Enter," she called, quickly closing the book. To her surprise, it wasn't a servant who entered, but Lady Morwen herself. Her stepmother glided into the room, took one look at the demon prince's gifts, and went very, very pale. "You need to leave," Lady Morwen said without preamble. "Tonight, I'll help you." Lyraleth stared. In all the years since her father's remarriage, Lady Morwen had never shown her anything approaching kindness. "Why would you?" Because I know what he is. Lady Morwen's perfect composure cracked, showing genuine fear underneath. 20 years ago, before I married your father, I served in the court of the Winter Queen. I've seen what the Shadow Fae do to their brides. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. They don't just marry you, Lyraleth. They transform you, body, mind, and soul. By the time the bonding is complete, you won't even remember wanting to be human. That should have been terrifying. So why did it sound almost appealing? What if I don't want to remain human? The question surprised them both. Lady Morwen recoiled, as if Lyraleth had slapped her. You don't know what you're saying. The magic will corrupt you, change you into something monstrous, more monstrous than I already am. The bitterness in Lyraleth's voice cut through the room like a blade. More of a disappointment than the fat, useless daughter who's brought nothing but shame to this family. That's not, Lady Morwen started, then stopped, because they both knew it was exactly what she'd thought for years.
He says I have power,
Lyraleth continued, her voice growing stronger.
that my body is built for magic, not weakness, that I'm exactly what I'm supposed to be. She looked down at her hands, half expecting to see them glowing. What if he's right?
Lady Morwen was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was soft, almost sad. Your grandmother used to say the same things. My grandmother, Elena, your father's mother. Lady Morwen moved to the window, staring out at the morning mist. She was different, powerful in ways that made people uncomfortable, always talking about old magic, ancient bloodlines, the power that runs in curves and shadows. Lyraleth felt her pulse quicken. What happened to her? She died giving birth to your father. But before that, Lady Morwen hesitated. There were rumors about midnight visitors, about a lover who came to her only under the new moon, about a child who inherited more than just his mother's eyes. The implications hit like a physical blow. You're saying my father is part Fae? I'm saying your family tree has roots in very dark soil, and Prince Khaemwaset knows it. Before Lyraleth could ask more questions, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began forming on the inside of the windows. The candles flickered and went out, plunging the chamber into an eerie twilight. And in that twilight, a figure began to materialize. Prince Khaemwaset stepped out of the shadows as if they were a doorway, his crimson eyes fixed on Lady Morwen with obvious displeasure. Discussing family history. Are we? His voice could have frozen fire. How illuminating. Lady Morwen dropped into a deep curtsy, her earlier bravado completely gone. Your Highness, I was just leaving. The prince's tone brooked no argument. And you won't return to my bride's chambers without invitation. Are we clear? Lady Morwen fled without another word, leaving Lyraleth alone with her demonic fiancé. The silence stretched between them until Lyraleth found her courage. Is it true? She asked. About my grandmother? Prince Khaemwaset moved closer, his supernatural grace making no sound on the stone floor. Elena Ravencrest was one of the most powerful Shadow Fae to ever live among mortals. She chose love over duty, which was costly. Costly how? She gave up her immortality to bear your father, traded centuries of life for 20 mortal years of happiness. His expressions softened almost imperceptibly. It's why I recognized you so quickly. You have her eyes, her magic, her stubborn refusal to bow to anyone's expectations. Lyraleth felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but of something she'd never experienced before. Recognition, belonging.
You knew her?
She was my aunt. Prince Khaemwaset's smile was gentle now, genuine, which makes you family, little bride. This marriage isn't a business arrangement. It's a homecoming. Everything changed with those words. Suddenly, this wasn't about her father's debts or political alliances. This was about blood calling to blood, about a heritage she'd never known she possessed, about a family that might actually want her exactly as she was. Show me, she whispered. Prince Khaemwaset raised an eyebrow. Show you what? The magic, my true form, everything I was meant to be. His eyes flashed with something that might have been pride. Are you certain? Once begun, there's no going back. You'll never be fully human again. Lyraleth thought of 24 years of shame, of disappointment, of trying to make herself smaller to fit into a world that had no place for her, of the cruel whispers and pitying looks, of being called a curse on the family name. I was never fully human to begin with. Prince Khaemwaset extended his hand, palm up, then take my hand, cousin mine, and let me show you what you really are. Lyraleth looked at his offered hand, pale as moonlight, strong as steel, offering everything she'd ever dreamed of and everything she'd been taught to fear. She took it. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded into sensation. Power rushed through her veins like molten gold. Her body sang with newfound strength. Her senses expanded until she could hear the heartbeat of every living thing in the manor, smell the magic that infused the very stones of the building, see the ley lines of power that crisscrossed the mortal realm like a vast, glowing web. And in that moment of perfect clarity, Lyraleth understood exactly what she was. Not human, not fully fae, but something new, something that bridged both worlds, with a power that made both her father's borrowed magic and her stepmother's preservation spells look like parlor tricks. She was magnificent. Beautiful, Prince Khaemwaset breathed, and she realized he wasn't just being polite. When she looked at herself, through his eyes, through fae eyes, she saw what he saw. A woman built to contain oceans of power, curves that spoke of abundance, fertility, the endless creative force of life itself, eyes that held the depth of starlight and the promise of storms, magic that pulsed with every heartbeat, ready to reshape the world itself. 2 more days, Prince Khaemwaset said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. Can you wait 2 more days to come home? Lyraleth looked around her childhood chamber, at the narrow bed where she'd cried herself to sleep so many nights, at the mirror that had shown her nothing but flaws, at the life that had been built to contain her rather than celebrate her. I've waited 24 years. What's 2 more days? But as Prince Khaemwaset faded back into shadow, leaving her alone with the echo of newfound power and the promise of a life beyond her wildest dreams, Lyraleth couldn't shake the feeling that those 2 days were going to change everything. She had no idea how right she was. The night before your wedding should be spent in nervous anticipation, not discovering your family's plans to murder your groom. The day of the blood moon dawned grey and cold, as if even the sun was reluctant to witness what was to come. Lyraleth woke with magic humming in her veins, and a strange certainty that nothing would go according to plan. She was right. The first sign of trouble came with breakfast. Instead of her usual simple meal, elaborate spread appeared in her chambers. Exotic fruits that seemed to glow with inner light, bread that smelled of honey and starlight, wine so dark it was almost black, all of it beautiful, all of it clearly magical, and all of it making her newly awakened senses scream warnings. Poison, all of it laced with something designed to suppress fae magic. Lady Morwen's work, Lyraleth muttered, pushing the tray away. Her stepmother might fear the shadow fae, but apparently not enough to avoid trying to sabotage the wedding. The second sign came when she tried to leave her chambers. The door wouldn't open, not locked, sealed. She could feel the magic wound around the handle like invisible chains, designed to keep her contained until what? Until they could drug her unconscious and hand her over like a docile sacrifice. Not likely. Lyraleth pressed her palm against the cold wood and let her newfound power flow. The sealing spell fought back, but it had been designed to contain a powerless human girl, not a partially awakened shadow fae. It shattered like spun glass. The third sign was waiting for her in the corridor outside. Armed guards, 6 of them, wearing the Raven Crest colors and carrying weapons that gleamed with enchantments designed to harm supernatural creatures. Lady Lyraleth, their captain said, with uncomfortable formality, your father requests your presence in the Great Hall for preparations.
Preparations. Right.
Of course he does. Lyraleth smiled and was pleased to see several of the guards step backward. Apparently her awakening was more visible than she thought. Lead the way. But as they escorted her through the twisting corridors of Ravencrest Manor, Lyraleth's enhanced hearing picked up conversations that made her blood run cold. A circle is prepared in the old dungeon, and iron chains blessed by the Temple of Purity. Once the demon is bound, we can extract what we need from him and dispose of the body. They weren't planning a wedding, they were planning an ambush. Her father intended to trap Prince Khaemwaset, steal his power, and likely kill both him and Lyraleth to eliminate any witnesses. The marriage contract was just bait to get the prince into a warded space where his supernatural abilities would be neutralized. Rage filled Lyraleth like molten metal in a forge. These people, her own family, was so disgusted by what she was that they'd rather commit murder than let her find happiness. They'd rather destroy a centuries-old alliance than accept that their cursed daughter might actually be valuable, exactly as she was. Well, two could play at betrayal. The great hall of Ravencrest Manor had been transformed for the occasion. What should have been a wedding venue looked more like a ritual sacrifice chamber. The usual furniture had been cleared away, replaced by a massive summoning circle carved directly into the stone floor. The walls were lined with protective wards and iron spikes. Chains hung from the ceiling like metallic ivy, and there, standing at the center of it all, was Lord Aldrich Ravencrest, looking more animated than he had in months. Ah, Lyraleth. He actually smiled when he saw her, which was somehow more unsettling than his usual disappointment. Come, we need to discuss your role in tonight's ceremony. My role? Oh yes, my dear, you're the key to everything. Lord Aldrich gestured to the summoning circle. Your blood will power the binding. Your connection to the demon prince will lure him into the trap. And once he's contained, his eyes gleamed with anticipation. Once he's contained, we'll have access to Shadow Fae magic without any of the inconvenient alliances or marriage contracts. Lyraleth looked around the hall, taking in every detail with her enhanced senses. 15 armed guards, 3 battle mages hired from the local temple, enough iron and blessed silver to kill a small army of supernatural creatures. And her father, standing in the middle of it all, so proud of his clever betrayal. There's just one problem with your plan, father. Lord Aldrich frowned. What's that? You forgot to account for the fact that I might not want to murder my fiancé. The temperature in the hall began to drop. Frost formed on the windows. The candles flickered as if blown by an unfelt wind. And Lyraleth smiled. You see, she continued conversationally, as shadows began gathering around her feet like living things. It turns out I rather like being part Fae. I like the magic. I like the power. I like being exactly what I'm supposed to be instead of apologizing for taking up space. Lord Aldrich backed away, his face going pale. Lyraleth, you don't understand what you're doing. That demon has corrupted you. Corrupted me. Lydia's laugh was like breaking glass. Father, I've spent my entire life being told I was broken, worthless, a curse on the family name. And now when I finally discover that I'm actually something magnificent, you want to murder the only person who's ever seen my value. The shadows were moving faster now, reaching toward the hired mages like grasping fingers. The temperature continued to plummet. I don't think so. Seize her, Lord Aldrich shouted. But the guards who stepped forward found themselves suddenly unable to move, shadow stuff wrapped around their legs like chains, holding them in place. The binding won't work, Lyraleth continued, as if nothing had happened. You based your trap on the assumption that Prince Khaemwaset would be walking into hostile territory. But this is neutral ground now. I'm claiming it. She spread her arms wide, and power poured out of her like water through a broken dam. The carefully drawn wards began to smoke and crack. The iron spikes grew so cold, they shattered. The blessed chains turned black and crumbled. I, Lyraleth, of the House Ravencrest, daughter of Elena the Shadow-Touched, claim this hall as neutral ground under the ancient laws. Let all who would break the peace answer to me. The words rang with power, that made the very stones of the manor tremble. And in the sudden silence that followed, Prince Khaemwaset stepped out of shadow and into the hall. He looked magnificent. Gone was the almost human appearance he'd worn during the previous meetings. This was the Shadow Prince in all his otherworldly glory, tall as a tree, beautiful as starlight, dangerous as a winter storm. His power filled the room like a tangible presence, making every mortal present want to kneel in submission. But his crimson eyes were fixed only on Lyraleth. "My lady bride," he said with a formal bow that somehow managed to be both respectful and mocking. "I believe you called for me." Lord Aldrich had gone grey with terror. This isn't possible. The wards were designed by mortals who understand neither shadow magic nor the power of blood claims. Prince Khaemwaset said mildly, "My bride has awakened to her heritage, Lord Ravencrest. Your little trap was doomed the moment she chose her true family over her birth family. You're saying she did this deliberately?" "I'm saying," Lyraleth stepped forward to stand beside her prince, feeling power and confidence flow through her like wine, "that I'm done being ashamed of what I am, done trying to fit into a world that was never meant for me, done letting people who can't see past their own narrow prejudices decide my worth." She looked around the hall at the faces of people who had known her all her life, servants who had whispered about her behind her back, nobles who had mocked her at social gatherings, family members who had treated her like a burden to be endured. "I am Lyraleth of the Shadow Court, daughter of two worlds, heir to powers you can't even imagine, and I choose exile." The magic that poured out of her with those words reshaped the very air. The great hall of Ravencrest Manor became something else, a threshold between worlds, a gateway that connected the mortal realm to the Shadow Court. "Magnificent," Prince Khaemwaset murmured, and she could hear genuine admiration in his voice. "Though I believe the proper term is choose transformation, my dear. Exile implies punishment. This is victory." He was right. As Lyraleth looked around the hall, at her terrified father, her scheming stepmother, the guards and mages, who were now cowering against the walls, she felt no sadness, no regret, only a deep, satisfying sense of justice, finally served. "Shall we proceed with the ceremony?" Prince Khaemwaset offered her his arm with old-world courtesy. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to deal with the assassination attempt first." Lyraleth considered this. Part of her, the part that had endured years of cruel comments and deliberate humiliation, wanted to make them all pay, wanted to show them exactly how powerful the worthless daughter had become. But a larger part of her was simply done with this place, these people, this life that had never fit her properly. "Let's just go home." Prince Khaemwaset's smile was brilliant with pride and something warmer, something that might have been love. "As you wish, my lady, though I should warn you," his eyes glittered with mischief. "The Shadow Court has very different ideas about wedding ceremonies. Are you prepared for 3 days of celebration involving every supernatural creature in the realm?" Lyraleth thought about it. 3 days of being celebrated instead of hidden. 3 days of being admired instead of criticized. 3 days of magical creatures treating her like a queen instead of mortals treating her like a disappointment. "I can hardly wait." And as they stepped through the gateway between worlds, hand in hand, Lyraleth felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt like she was finally going home. Culture shock is one thing, but when your new home operates on entirely different laws of physics, adjustment period takes on a whole new meaning. The first thing Lyraleth noticed about the Shadow Realm was that it was impossible. Not impossible in the sense of being difficult to believe, impossible in the sense of actively defying every law of nature she'd ever learned. The sky was simultaneously pitch black and blazing with stars, so bright they cast actual shadows. The ground beneath her feet felt solid, but looked like it was made of crystallized moonlight. And in the distance, floating mountains drifted through the air like enormous ships, navigating seas of mist. "Welcome home, princess." Prince Khaemwaset's voice had changed along with everything else. In the mortal realm, it had been beautiful, but recognizably male. Here, it carried harmonics, that shouldn't exist, notes that resonated in dimensions she was only just learning to perceive. Princess Lyraleth managed to ask, though speech felt strange, when the very air seemed to listen and respond to her words. Of course. He gestured toward a structure in the distance that defied every architectural principle ever conceived. It was simultaneously a castle, a tree, and a crystal formation, growing from the ground like something alive, while maintaining the elegant proportions of deliberate design. As my bride, you hold the title of Princess of Shadows, and once we're formally bonded, his smile showed those perfect, predatory teeth. Well, let's just say the Shadow Court has been without a queen for far too long. Queen. The word sent shivers through Lyraleth that had nothing to do with temperature. In the mortal world, she'd been the disappointing daughter of a minor noble house. Here, she was apparently destined to rule beside one of the most powerful beings in existence. The impossibility of it all should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like destiny. The others are eager to meet you, Prince Khaemwaset continued, as they walked along a path that seemed to form itself beneath their feet with each step. It's been 3 centuries since we've had new blood in the royal line. Others, the court, my family, advisors, friends. His expression grew fond. Many of them knew your grandmother. They've been curious about her descendant for decades. As they approached the impossible castle, Lyraleth began to make out individual figures waiting for them. Her enhanced vision showed her details that should have been invisible at such distance. A woman with butterfly wings that shifted through every color in the spectrum. A man whose skin seemed to be made of living shadow. Creatures that looked like they'd stepped out of the most beautiful nightmares ever dreamed. And every single one of them was staring at her.
Breathe, Prince Khaemwaset murmured, apparently noticing her tension. They're going to love you.
How can you be so sure? Because you're exactly what we've been waiting for. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Lyraleth, what do you see when you look at yourself? The question caught her off guard. What do you mean? Look down. Tell me what you see. Lyraleth glanced down at her body and gasped. The simple dress she'd been wearing in the mortal realm had transformed into something that belonged in dreams. The fabric seemed to be woven from starlight and shadow, flowing around her curves in a way that emphasized rather than concealed. Her skin had taken on a subtle luminescence, as if lit from within, and her hair moved like it was underwater, each strand catching and holding light that shouldn't exist. I look like a queen, he finished softly, like exactly what you were always meant to be. Before Lyraleth could respond, they were surrounded. The court of shadows materialized around them like a living dream. Dozens of beings so beautiful and terrible that her mortal mind struggled to process them all. But instead of the fear she expected to feel, Lyraleth was overwhelmed by something else entirely. Acceptance. They looked at her with curiosity, admiration, even delight, but not a single gaze held the judgment she'd grown so accustomed to in the mortal world. Alina's granddaughter, said the woman with butterfly wings, her voice like silver bells. You have her eyes, and her power. I can feel it singing in the air around you.
Lady Seraphine, Prince Khaemwaset said formally, "May I present my bride, Princess Lyraleth of the Shadow Court?"
The introductions that followed were a blur of impossible names and inhuman beauty. Lord Malphus, whose shadow moved independently of his body, the twin sisters Nyx and Umbra, who seemed to share one soul between 2 forms, Duke Asmodeus, who looked like a fallen angel and radiated power that made the air itself tremble. But it was the smallest member of the group who made the biggest impression. A child who appeared to be maybe 10 years old stepped forward, though her ancient eyes suggested she was far older than she looked. Her skin was pale as moonlight, her hair silver as starshine, and when she smiled, Lyraleth could see tiny fangs. Aunt Lyraleth, the child chirped with obvious delight. I'm Vesper. Uncle Khaim told me you have magic like mine. Aunt? Lyraleth looked questioningly at Prince Khaemwaset. who smiled with obvious affection for the child. My sister's daughter. She's been quite eager to meet another partially mortal fae. The full-bloods sometimes have trouble understanding our unique perspective. What kind of magic do you have? Lyraleth asked, crouching down to the child's level. Vesper's grin widened. Watch. The little girl held out her hands, and suddenly the air around him filled with butterflies made of pure light, not illusions, actual butterflies with wings of crystallized radiance that cast rainbow shadows as they fluttered through the impossible twilight. They're beautiful, Lyraleth breathed. Papa says I make them because I'm happy, Vesper confided. The happier I am, the more beautiful they get. What does your magic do? Lyraleth looked around at the assembled court, suddenly self-conscious. She'd barely begun to understand her own abilities. What if she embarrassed herself? What if... Show us, Lady Seraphine encouraged gently. There's no judgment here, child. Only curiosity and welcome. Only welcome. Lyraleth closed her eyes and let herself feel the magic that had been singing in her veins since her awakening. It was different here in the shadow realm, stronger, clearer, more responsive to her will. She thought about what she wanted to create, what would represent how she felt in this moment. When she opened her eyes, the entire courtyard had been transformed. Where before there had been crystallized moonlight, now there were gardens of impossible beauty, flowers that bloomed with captured starlight, trees whose leaves chimed like bells in the eternal twilight breeze, fountains that flowed upward, their water defying gravity to create spiraling sculptures of liquid crystal, and everywhere, woven through it all like a living tapestry, were vines that pulsed with warm, golden light, the visual representation of happiness and belonging that Lyraleth had never known she could feel. The assembled court burst into spontaneous applause. Magnificent, Duke Asmodeus declared. True creation magic. We haven't seen its like since Elena, Lady Seraphine finished softly. Oh my dear child, you are going to be extraordinary. But I don't understand any of this, Lyraleth protested, gesturing helplessly at the gardens she'd apparently created without conscious thought. I don't know how to be a princess, or use magic, or rule anything. I don't even know your customs, or laws. Peace, Prince Khaemwaset said gently, taking her hand. No one expects you to know everything immediately. You'll learn. We'll teach you. Besides, Vesper added with the confidence only children possess, being magic is easy. You just have to stop trying to be what other people want and start being what you actually are, out of the mouths of babes, even immortal ones. Speaking of which, Prince Khaemwaset said, his tone shifting to something more formal, there are things you need to know about our bonding ceremony. It's rather more involved than mortal weddings. How involved? Lyraleth asked suspiciously. Well, he began diplomatically. It lasts 3 days, involves ritual magic that will permanently intertwine our souls, and requires you to be presented to the entire Shadow Court as their future queen. Lyraleth felt her newly found confidence waver. The entire court? Several thousand supernatural beings. Yes, demons, fair, spirits, entities that don't have names in mortal tongues. His crimson eyes danced with amusement at her expression. Don't worry, they're going to love you. How could they not? Several thousand. What if I mess something up? What if I say the wrong thing, or trip during some important ritual? Then you'll be endearingly human, and they'll love you even more for it. Prince Khaemwaset lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Lyraleth, you've already impressed the most important members of my inner circle, without even trying. The rest will be easy. Easy? Lord Marthas laughed, his shadow writhing with amusement. Khaemwaset, my friend, I don't think you've mentioned the trials yet. Prince Khaemwaset shot his advisor a warning look. The trials are optional. What trials? Lyraleth demanded. Ancient tradition, Lady Seraphine explained, with obvious reluctance. Any potential consort to the Shadow Prince must prove themselves worthy of the crown by facing 3 challenges, one of power, one of wisdom, and one of heart. But they're optional, Prince Khaemwaset repeated firmly. You don't have to. I'll do them. The words were out of Lyraleth's mouth before she'd consciously decided to speak them. But once said, she realized they felt right. She'd spent her entire life being told she wasn't good enough, strong enough, worthy enough. Maybe it was time to prove otherwise. Lyraleth, Prince Khaemwaset, began carefully. The trials are dangerous. They're designed to test beings with centuries of magical experience. You've been awakened for less than a week, and in less than a week, I've discovered I can create gardens with my thoughts and reshape reality with my emotions. Lyraleth interrupted. I think I can handle whatever your court throws at me. The assembled nobles exchanged glances, impressed, worried, amused. Very well, Prince Khaemwaset said finally, though he looked torn between pride and concern. If that's truly what you want, but you should know, the trials aren't just about proving yourself to the court. They'll change you, challenge you in ways you can't imagine, make you face truths about yourself that you might not be ready to confront. Lyraleth thought about the woman she'd been just days ago, ashamed, hiding, convinced she was broken. Then she looked around at the impossible garden she'd created, felt the power humming in her veins, saw the acceptance and admiration in the eyes of beings she was only beginning to understand. I've spent 24 years being someone I wasn't. I think it's time to find out who I actually am. Prince Khaemwaset's smile was brilliant with pride and something deeper, something that might have been love. Then tomorrow, he declared to the assembled court, we begin the trials of ascension. Let it be known throughout the Shadow Realm that Princess Lyraleth will face the ancient challenges and claim her place as our queen. The court erupted in cheers and applause, but Lyraleth barely heard them. She was too busy staring at Prince Khaemwaset, at the way he looked at her like she was something precious and powerful and perfect, exactly as she was. Tomorrow, she would face trials designed to test centuries of magical experience. Tonight, she would sleep in a castle made of starlight and dreams. And for the first time in her life, she couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. They say power corrupts, but no one mentions how intoxicating it is to finally have enough. Lyraleth woke in a bed made of crystallized moonlight, to the sound of silver bells ringing across the Shadow Realm. Her chambers, and she still couldn't quite believe, she had chambers plural, were filled with soft, ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. A gown waited for her, draped across a chair that looked like it had grown rather than been built. The dress was magnificent, deep purple silk that shifted to black in the shadows, embroidered with silver threads that formed patterns of stars and roses. It was clearly designed for ceremony, but more importantly, it was designed for her body, celebrating her curves rather than hiding them. But that wasn't what made her heart race. Lying beside the gown was a circlet of black diamonds and silver, delicate as spun glass, but radiating power that made her fingertips tingle just looking at it. A princess's crown, her crown. The first trial begins at moonrise, came Prince Khaemwaset's voice from beyond the door, though she couldn't tell if he was speaking aloud or directly into her mind. Are you ready, my brave princess? As ready as I'll ever be, she called back, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The truth was, she felt more ready than she had any right to. The magic in her blood had grown stronger overnight. Fed by the ambient power of the Shadow Realm, she could feel it coursing through her like liquid starlight, responsive to her thoughts and emotions in ways that would have terrified her mortal self. But she wasn't mortal anymore, not entirely, and that made all the difference. The arena of trials was impossible, like everything else in the Shadow Realm. It was simultaneously an outdoor amphitheater carved from black volcanic glass and an indoor cathedral with a ceiling that showed all the stars in the universe. Thousands of supernatural beings filled the seats, demons with wings like bat leather, fae with skin that shifted color with their moods, spirits that looked like living aurora borealis, and all of them were watching her. The first trial, announced Lord Marphus, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the impossible space, is the trial of power. The candidate must demonstrate Not only magical ability, but the wisdom to use that power responsibly. A section of the arena floor began to change, transforming into something that made Lyraleth's blood run cold. A perfect replica of Ravencrest Manor's Great Hall, complete down to the last tapestry and the scorch marks her awakening magic had left on the stones. But this version wasn't empty. Figures began materializing in the Phantom Hall, perfect recreations of her father, her stepmother, her brother, all the servants and nobles who had treated her with such casual cruelty over the years. They moved and spoke as if alive, their voices carrying clearly across the arena. Look at her stuffing her face again, like a pig. No man will ever want something so grotesque. She's a curse on the family name. Why couldn't we have had another son instead of this disappointment? Every cruel word she'd ever heard, every dismissive glance, every moment of shame and humiliation played out before thousands of witnesses. Your task, Lord Malphus continued implacably, is to demonstrate power. Show us what you would do to those who wronged you, now that you have the strength to make them pay. The arena fell silent. Even the whisper of wings and the rustle of inhuman movements stopped. Everyone was waiting to see what the new princess would do with unlimited power and the perfect opportunity for revenge. Lyraleth stepped into the Phantom Hall, power crackling around her like visible lightning. The recreated figures turned toward her, their expressions shifting from dismissal to shock to fear as they recognized what she'd become. Her father stumbled backward, his face going pale. Lyraleth? But you're beautiful, powerful, everything you said I could never be? Her voice rang with newfound confidence and barely contained magic. Yes, father, I am. She could feel the crowd's anticipation, their hunger for spectacle and vengeance. They wanted her to strike, to show these phantoms exactly what happened when you underestimated a Shadow Fae princess, and she wanted to give them what they expected. The power in her veins sang with possibilities. She could make them suffer, as she had suffered, could show them what it felt like to be helpless and judged and found wanting, could demonstrate the terrible price of cruelty in ways that would echo through the Shadow Realm for centuries. But as she raised her hand, ready to unleash devastation, something stopped her. Vesper's voice, from the night before. Being magic is easy. You just have to stop trying to be what other people want and start being what you actually are. Or was she really? Not cruel, not vindictive, not someone who would torture others for the pleasure of an audience, no matter how much they might deserve it. She was someone who created gardens where there had been barren ground, someone who chose love over hatred, building over destroying. Lyraleth lowered her hand. You spent my entire life trying to make me smaller, she said to the phantom figures, her voice carrying clearly throughout the arena, trying to convince me that I was broken, worthless, a mistake. But you were wrong, she gestured, and the hall around them began to change. The dark stone lightened to warm marble, the heavy tapestries dissolved into climbing roses that filled the air with sweetness. Sunlight poured through windows that had been narrow and mean, expanding them into soaring archways that welcomed the day. I am not a curse, she continued, her magic reshaping reality with every word. I am abundance. I am creativity. I am the power to make beautiful things in a world that has too much darkness. The phantom figures watched in amazement as their hall of judgment became something bright and welcoming, a place where people would want to gather, to celebrate, to find joy instead of fear. And that is what I choose to be, not your victim, not your tormentor, but something entirely new. The arena erupted, not in applause, though that came too, but in something far more profound. Magic responded to magic, and every supernatural being present felt the truth of what she demonstrated. Power used, not to destroy, but to transform. Strength channeled into creation, rather than vengeance. Remarkable, Lord Malphus declared, his shadow writhing with obvious excitement. In 3,000 years of trials, no candidate has ever chosen transformation over retribution. Prince Khaemwaset appeared at her side, having apparently transported himself directly into the arena. His crimson eyes blazed with pride and something deep. "You magnificent, impossible woman," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Pass the trial? Redefined it." His smile was brilliant. "The trial of power has always been about demonstrating strength through conquest. You just proved that the greatest power is the wisdom to know when not to use it." Around him, the Phantom Hall continued its transformation, becoming something that belonged more in dreams than nightmares. Lyraleth watched her recreation of Lord Aldrich stare in wonder at walls that now showed scenes of joy instead of grim family portraits. "Besides," she said thoughtfully, "revenge would have been easy. Anyone with power can destroy. It takes real strength to build something better." "The first trial is concluded," Lord Marfus announced to the cheering crowd. "Princess Lyraleth has passed with distinction." But even as the arena celebrated around her, Lyraleth felt a stirring of anticipation mixed with nervousness. The trial of power had been about external forces, proving herself to others, demonstrating her magical abilities. The next two trials would be about internal truths, about facing the parts of herself she'd kept hidden, even from herself. And somehow, she suspected those were going to be much more dangerous. The space between trials is where the real transformation happens, when you're too tired to maintain facades and too honest to lie to yourself. That night, as the Shadow Court celebrated her success with revelries that defied mortal comprehension, Lyraleth found herself alone on a balcony that overlooked the impossible landscape of her new home. The celebration continued below. Laughter that sounded like silver bells. Music played on instruments that existed in more dimensions than three. The happy chaos of beings who had waited centuries for something to truly celebrate. But she needed quiet. She needed to process what had happened, what was still to come, and the growing certainty that she was changing into someone she didn't entirely recognize yet. Overwhelming, isn't it? She turned to find Prince Khaemwaset approaching, carrying two goblets of something that sparkled with inner light. It shared the formal attire of the trial, or something more comfortable. Dark pants that looked like they'd been cut from midnight sky, a shirt that seemed to be woven from shadow itself. And yet somehow, he'd never looked more human. "A little," she admitted, accepting the goblet gratefully. The liquid inside tasted like starlight and honey, warming her from the inside out. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me this is all an elaborate dream." "Dreams are overrated," Prince Khaemwaset said, settling beside her at the balcony rail. "Reality is far more interesting." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching creatures that had no names in mortal tongues dance across the twilight sky. Eventually, Lyraleth worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her since the trial ended. "Was it wrong, what I did in there?" He turned to look at her, crimson eyes reflecting starlight. "What do you mean?" The crowd wanted blood, vengeance, a demonstration of power that would hurt the people who hurt me. She took another sip of her drink, choosing her words carefully. "Instead, I gave them a garden party." "What kind of queen does that make me?" Prince Khaemwaset was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know," he said finally, "what your grandmother did during her trial of power? She had to face trials too?" "Oh yes, Elena's trial was different. She was presented with an enemy of our people, a mortal lord who had been hunting and killing Shadow Fae for sport, turning our essence into potions that promised extended youth." His voice darkened with old anger. "The expectation was that she would demonstrate her loyalty to our kind by making his death appropriately creative. What did she do?" "She healed him." Lyraleth nearly choked on her drink. "She what?" The man had been driven mad by the very potions he'd been consuming. Decades of shadow essence had corrupted his mind, filled him with paranoid delusions that made him see threats everywhere. Elena recognized the signs and fixed him. Prince Khaemwaset's expression grew distant with memory. When his sanity returned and he understood what he'd done, the shame and horror broke him completely. He spent the rest of his life making amends, using his wealth to protect the very creatures he'd once hunted. And the court accepted that. They were surprised. But Elena had demonstrated something more valuable than the ability to cause pain. She'd shown wisdom, compassion, the understanding that true power sometimes means choosing the harder path because it leads to better outcomes. He turned to face her fully. You are so much like her, Lyraleth, not just in appearance or magical ability, but in the fundamental goodness that guides your choices. The words hit her like a physical blow. Goodness? She laughed, but it sounded bitter even to her own ears. Khaemwaset, you don't understand. I'm not good. I'm not kind or compassionate, or any of the things you think I am. His eyebrows rose. Oh, I wanted to hurt them. The admission came out in a rush, as if saying it quickly would make it less true. When I saw those phantoms, when I heard all those cruel words again, I wanted to make them suffer. I wanted to show them what it felt like to be powerless and judged and found lacking. And the only reason I didn't was because I realized it would disappoint you, disappoint the court, make me look petty and weak. She set down her goblet with more force than necessary. I chose mercy for selfish reasons, not noble ones. Prince Khaemwaset was quiet for so long that Lyraleth began to worry she'd said too much, revealed too much of the darkness that still lived in her heart despite all the magical transformation. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle with understanding. Lyraleth, do you know what most candidates do during the trial of power? She shook her head.
They give the crowd exactly what it wants. Blood, screams, elaborate demonstrations of cruelty that leave everyone satisfied and slightly sick. He moved closer, his presence warm in the cool night air, and they tell themselves they're doing it for justice, or honor, or the good of the realm. They find noble reasons to justify ignoble actions.
But I wanted to be cruel and chose not to be. She couldn't keep the self-recrimination out of her voice. How is that better? Because, Prince Khaemwaset said softly, reaching out to tilt her chin up until she was looking directly into his eyes. Recognizing the darkness in yourself and choosing light anyway is the most courageous thing anyone can do. You could have hurt them. You wanted to hurt them. You had every right to hurt them. And you chose mercy instead. Even though my reasons were selfish. Especially because your reasons were selfish. His smile was brilliant, with affection. You wanted to be someone I could be proud of. Someone worthy of the crown you'll wear. Someone who builds instead of destroying. Those aren't noble impulses, my dear. They're human ones, and there is nothing more beautiful than a heart that chooses to be better than it has to be. The words settled into her chest like warmth, melting something that had been frozen there for longer than she cared to admit. I've never had anyone be proud of me before, she whispered. Then you've been surrounded by fools. Prince Khaemwaset moved closer, close enough that she could feel the supernatural heat that radiated from his skin. Lyraleth, in the 3 days I've known you, you've awakened powers that take most Fae decades to master. You've transformed from a frightened mortal girl into a woman who can reshape reality with her emotions. You've faced your greatest fears and chosen compassion over vengeance. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing over her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. How could I not be proud? How could I not be completely, utterly, impossibly in love with you? Love. The word hung between them like a bridge neither of them had expected to cross so soon. Lyraleth's heart hammered against her ribs as she searched his face for any sign that he didn't mean it, that it was just supernatural courtship or political necessity. I love you too. The words came out in a rush, unplanned and completely honest. And as soon as she said them, she realized they were true. Not infatuation with his otherworldly beauty, not gratitude for his acceptance, not the desperate attachment of someone who'd finally found belonging. Real love, the kind that saw all the flaws and chose to stay anyway. The kind that celebrated strengths without trying to fix weaknesses. The kind that made you want to be better, not because you were lacking, but because someone worth loving deserve the best version of yourself. Prince Khaemwaset's answering smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Well then, he murmured, leaning closer until his forehead rested against hers. Suppose we should make this official. And he kissed her. Not the formal kiss of political alliance she'd been expecting, but something real and desperate and full of promises neither of them had planned to make. It was a kiss that tasted of starlight and possibilities, of power shared rather than taken, of two souls recognizing their perfect complement. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lyraleth realized the balcony around them had transformed. Where before there had been plain stone, now there were night-blooming flowers that glowed with soft inner light. The stars themselves seemed brighter, more numerous, as if the universe itself was celebrating their declaration. "Did we do that?" she asked breathlessly. "Combined magic tends to be enthusiastic," Prince Khaemwaset replied, though he didn't sound particularly concerned. If anything, he looked pleased by the spontaneous display of power. "Is that going to be a problem? During the other trials, I mean?" His expression grew serious. "Lyraleth, there's something you should know about the remaining trials. They're not just tests of individual ability. They're designed to evaluate you as a potential partner to me specifically." "What does that mean?" "It means the magic will try to separate us, to test whether our bond is strong enough to withstand external pressure. The trial of wisdom, in particular." He hesitated. "It will show you versions of the future, possible outcomes based on the choices you make. Some of those visions will be designed to convince you that staying with me is the wrong decision." Lyraleth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. What kind of visions? The kind that prey on your deepest fears, that tell you you're not good enough, not strong enough, not worthy of the power you're being offered. His grip on her hands tightened. The kind that make you believe you'd be happier if you walked away from all of this and returned to your old life. The idea of returning to Ravencrest Manor, to the small room and smaller expectations, to being the disappointing daughter who brought shame to the family name, made something inside her recoil in absolute rejection. "That's not going to happen," she said with quiet certainty. "Are you sure?" "The visions will be very convincing, and they'll offer you alternatives that seem reasonable, safe, comfortable." "Khaemwaset." She reached up to cup his face the way he'd done to her, marveling at the way his eyes fluttered closed at her touch. 3 days ago, I was the unwanted daughter of a minor noble house, convinced I was broken and worthless and destined for nothing but disappointment. Tonight, I'm a princess of the Shadow Court, engaged to a man who sees magic in my very existence, surrounded by people who celebrate my power instead of fearing it. Do you really think there's any vision convincing enough to make me give this up?" His smile was brilliant, with relief and something deeper. "When you put it like that. Besides," she added, with a grin that felt foreign on her face. Since when did she grin with such confidence? "I'm not the same person who would have been swayed by comfortable lies. That woman was afraid of her own power. I'm not afraid anymore." And as she said it, Lyraleth realized it was true. She wasn't afraid anymore, not of the trials to come, not of the responsibilities of queenship, not even of the possibility that she might fail. For the first time in her life, she was more excited by the possibility of what she might become than she was terrified by the risk of falling short. It was the most liberating feeling she'd ever experienced. "2 more trials," Prince Khaemwaset murmured against her lips as he leaned in for another kiss. "2 more trials," she agreed, and then they would be bound forever. 2 souls, sharing one impossible destiny in a realm where anything was possible, and she was finally home. Wisdom isn't about knowing the right answer. It's about asking the right questions when every answer seems wrong. The second trial began at dawn, though in the Shadow Realm, dawn was marked not by the rising of a sun, but by the shift from silver starlight to gold. Lyraleth woke to find her chambers filled with soft, warm radiance, and a sense of anticipation that made her skin hum with barely contained magic. Today's gown was different from yesterday's, simpler in some ways, more complex in others. Deep midnight blue silk that seemed to contain entire galaxies in its folds, with a neckline that celebrated her décolletage and sleeves that flowed like water. The circlet waiting for her had changed too, from black diamonds to sapphires that held the depth of ocean depths. She was beginning to understand that her clothes were more than just attire. They were expressions of the magic itself, adapting to whatever trial lay ahead. Today will be harder, Prince Khaemwaset had warned her the night before. The trial of power tested your magical ability. The trial of wisdom will test your judgment, your understanding of consequence and choice. It will show you futures that could be and ask you to choose between them. And the trial of heart? She'd asked. His expression had grown distant. That one will test whether you're capable of the kind of love that rulership requires. Not just love for me, but for all the beings who will depend on you as their queen. Now, as she made her way through the impossible corridors of the castle toward the arena of trials, Lyraleth wondered if she was truly ready for any of this. The trial of power had been straightforward: demonstrate magical ability, make a choice about revenge, prove she could be trusted with power. But wisdom? How did one prove wisdom? The arena had transformed overnight. Where yesterday there had been amphitheater, seating surrounding a ritual space, today there was something that looked more like a vast library, crossed with an observatory. Shelves stretched up into infinity, filled with books that glowed with their own inner light. The ceiling showed not just stars, but entire galaxies wheeling in cosmic dance, their movements somehow synchronized with the turning of pages in the countless volumes below. And at the center of it all stood a single chair that looked like it had been grown rather than built, a throne made of living wood and crystallized starlight. The oracle's chair, the second trial, announced Lady Seraphine, her butterfly wings shimmering with nervous energy, is the trial of wisdom. The candidate will sit in the oracle's chair and witness 3 visions of possible futures. She must choose which path to follow, knowing that her choice will bind not just herself, but all who depend on her. The assembled court was quieter today, more serious. This wasn't entertainment. This was a test that would literally determine the future of their realm. If Lyraleth chose poorly, if her judgment was found wanting, the consequences would ripple out for centuries. No pressure at all. Lyraleth approached the chair with as much dignity as she could muster. The moment she sat down, the world dissolved. Vision 1, the safe path. She was back in Ravencrest Manor, but it was different, cleaner, brighter, somehow more welcoming. She stood in the Great Hall, the original version, not the transformed space she'd created during yesterday's trial, and watched herself living a life she recognized. This version of Lyraleth was smaller, not just physically, though she was that too. The magic had been suppressed, a Fey heritage buried so deeply it might never surface again, but smaller in every way that mattered. Quieter, more careful, more ordinary. In this vision, she had never met Prince Khaemwaset. Her father's debts had been paid through more conventional means: land sales, marriage alliances, political maneuvering. She lived a quiet life as a maiden aunt to her brother's children, useful but unnoticed, content but unremarkable. She watched this other version of herself, tend a small garden behind the manor, growing ordinary herbs for ordinary purposes. No magic sparked at her fingertips, no power hummed in her veins. She was simply human, and she looked happy, content at least. There was no shame in her posture, no self-consciousness about her body. She'd made peace with being unremarkable, found joy in small things: a letter from a friend, a successful harvest, the laughter of children who loved their gentle aunt. Safe, whispered a voice that might have been the oracle itself. Peaceful, no grand destinies, no impossible choices, no burden of rulership, just a quiet life lived without fear of failure, because nothing remarkable is ever attempted. The vision faded, leaving Lyraleth gasping in the oracle's chair. That could have been her life. Still could be, if she chose it. Return to the mortal realm, suppress her magic, live as a beloved spinster aunt, who caused no trouble and left no mark on history. It was terrifying how appealing parts of it had looked. Vision 2, the selfish path. This time, she stood in a palace that made the Shadow Court look modest by comparison. Walls of pure gold stretched toward a ceiling painted with scenes of cosmic creation. Servants, human, fae, and things that had no names, attended her every whim with obvious devotion. And there was herself again, but transformed beyond recognition. This Lyraleth blazed with power. Her magic wasn't the warm, creative force she'd felt growing within herself, but something harder, colder, more demanding. She ruled not just the Shadow Court, but multiple realms, her influence spreading across dimensions like a virus. She watched herself decree laws that favored the supernatural over mortals, that elevated magical beings to gods while reducing humanity to livestock. Cities burned in the mortal realm, while this version of Lyraleth laughed from her impossible throne, drunk on power and the intoxicating rush of never having to consider anyone else's needs above her own. Prince Khaemwaset was there too, but as a consort rather than equal partner. Beautiful, devoted, powerful, but diminished. Somehow, his own considerable abilities overshadowed by her insatiable hunger for more. Power, the oracle's voice whispered. All the power you ever dreamed of having when they called you worthless. Every slight avenged, every humiliation repaid 1,000-fold. Rule absolutely. Never apologize for taking up space. Never worry about anyone else's opinion ever again. But, as Lyraleth watched this version of herself sentence entire populations to servitude for the crime of being born mortal, she felt sick. This wasn't strength. It was the cruelty she'd been subjected to, magnified and justified by the intoxication of unlimited power. The vision faded, leaving her shaking with revulsion. She could become that. The potential lived within her. She'd felt it during yesterday's trial, the desire to make others suffer as she had suffered. Magic was just a tool. It was the heart that wielded it that determined whether it built or destroyed. Vision 3, the difficult path. The final vision was the most complex, unfolding like a symphony with movements that built upon each other in increasingly complicated harmonies. She saw herself as queen of the Shadow Court, but it wasn't the fairy tale coronation she'd imagined. Rulership, she discovered, was mostly about impossible choices and unintended consequences. A plague among the lesser fae that could only be cured with magic that would weaken the court's defenses against mortal incursions. Border disputes with the Winter Court that could be resolved through war or through a marriage alliance that would require her to give up her firstborn child to be raised by the enemy. A rebellion among the shadow demons that could be crushed through force or addressed by redistributing power in ways that would make the nobility hate her. She watched herself age, not physically, for fae royalty was essentially immortal, but in spirit, watched the bright confidence of early queenship give way to the weary wisdom of someone who had learned that every decision carried a price and someone always had to pay it. But she also saw the good that came from those hard choices. The plague cured, even at the cost of temporary vulnerability. The peace treaty signed, even though it meant saying goodbye to a daughter she would barely know. The rebellion not crushed, but transformed into reform, even though it meant years of political battles and assassination attempts. She saw herself and Prince Khaemwaset supporting each other through crises that would have destroyed lesser partnerships, saw them disagree, argue, even fight, but always with the underlying certainty that they were fighting for the same things: justice, protection for their people, a better world for those who came after. She saw their children beings of impossible beauty, who carried both shadow magic and mortal creativity, who would bridge worlds in ways their parents could barely imagine. And she saw herself, centuries later, looking back on a reign marked not by grand gestures or spectacular victories, but by the quiet satisfaction of problems solved, people protected, and a realm left better than she'd found it. The hardest path, the oracle whispered. No guarantees except the certainty of difficulty. Every choice will have consequences you can't foresee. Every victory will come with a price. Every day will require you to be better than you were the day before. Not because it's easy, but because people are depending on you to make the right choice even when there are no good options. All three visions faded, leaving Lyraleth alone in the observatory, with the weight of infinite futures pressing down on her shoulders. The assembled court waited in absolute silence. Even the cosmic machinery of the realm seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for her decision. 3 paths, 3 possible futures, 3 versions of herself. She could choose to become the safe path, return to humanity, live quietly, hurt no one, help few. The selfish path, embrace power without responsibility, rule through fear, take everything she'd ever been denied at the cost of becoming the very thing she'd always hated. The difficult path, accept the burden of rulership with all its impossible choices, knowing that she would fail sometimes, hurt people sometimes, but also knowing that she was the only one standing between her subjects and those who would exploit them. Standing slowly from the oracle's chair, Lyraleth felt the magic of choice itself flowing through her. "I choose," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the infinite library, the difficult path. The words rang with power that made the stars themselves seem to pulse in approval. "Not because I think I'll be perfect at it," she continued, feeling strength flow into her voice with each word. "Not because I'm not tempted by safety or power, but because someone has to make the hard choices, and I'd rather it be someone who understands what it feels like to be powerless than someone who's never known anything but privilege." Lady Seraphine's wings burst into brilliant prismatic light. Lord Malthus's shadow writhed with obvious approval. Even the ancient books seemed to flutter their pages in supernatural applause. But it was Prince Khaemwaset's expression that mattered most. He looked at her with such pride, such love, such perfect understanding, that she felt her heart might burst from the sheer intensity of it. This was what partnership looked like, not just romantic love, but the recognition of someone who would stand beside you through impossible choices and never make you face them alone. "The second trial is concluded," Lady Seraphine announced to the cheering masses. "Princess Lyraleth has demonstrated wisdom beyond her years." But even as the celebration began around her, Lyraleth felt a flutter of nervous anticipation in her chest. 2 trials down, 1 to go, and according to Prince Khaemwaset, the final trial would be the most dangerous of all. The trial of heart, the test that would determine whether she was capable of the kind of love that true rulership required. And somehow, despite everything she'd accomplished, that felt like the most terrifying challenge yet. They say love conquers all, but they never mention that sometimes love requires you to conquer yourself first. The night between the second and third trials was the longest of Lyraleth's life. Not because of fear, though there was that, but because of anticipation that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you were about to jump but not sure if there would be wings waiting or just the promise of flight. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself wondering what the trial of heart would demand of her. The trial of power had tested her magic and her mercy. The trial of wisdom had tested her judgment and her willingness to accept responsibility. What more could there be to prove? The answer came with the pre-dawn bells. This time, there was no gown waiting in her chambers. Instead, she found a simple white dress, not the elaborate creation magic of her previous trial attire, but something that looked hand-sewn, almost mortal in its simplicity. The only ornamentation was a silver cord that served as a belt, and even that was plain to the point of austerity. The clothes of a supplicant, not a queen. "Today," Prince Khaemwaset's voice came through the door, softer than usual. "You go alone?" Alone. That single word carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. Whatever the trial of heart demanded, she would face it without his support, without the court's encouragement, without any of the connections that had sustained her through the previous challenges. Just herself, and whatever love she carried in her heart. The arena had transformed once more, but this time the change was subtle, intimate. Where before there had been grand amphitheaters and cosmic observatories, today there was simply a garden, Not the impossible gardens she'd created with her magic, but something smaller, more personal, a space that felt like home, with familiar flowers and paths that seemed designed for quiet contemplation rather than grand spectacle. At the center of the garden was a simple stone bench, and sitting on that bench was a figure that made Lyraleth's heart stop. Herself. But not any of the versions she'd seen in the oracle's visions. This was her, as she'd been 3 days ago. Soft, uncertain, dressed in the simple browns and greys she'd worn in the mortal realm. The her who had believed she was broken, worthless, a burden on everyone around her. "Hello," said this other version of herself, looking up with eyes that held all the pain and shame Lyraleth had carried for 24 years. "We need to talk." "You're not real," Lyraleth said, though her voice shook with uncertainty. "I'm as real as the part of you that still believes you don't deserve any of this." The other Lyraleth gestured to the garden around them, to the impossible beauty of the shadow realm beyond, the part that wakes up every morning waiting for someone to realize they've made a mistake. The words hit like physical blows because they were true. Despite everything, the magic, the acceptance, the love she'd found, there was still a voice in the back of Lyraleth's mind that whispered doubts, that insisted this was all too good to be true, that someone like her couldn't really be meant for someone like Prince Khaemwaset, couldn't really be destined for the crown of the Shadow Court. "That's what this trial is about, isn't it?" she said, sinking onto the bench beside her other self. "Not love for other people, but learning to love myself." "The hardest kind of love there is," the other Lyraleth agreed. "Do you know what I see when I look at you? When I see what you've become?" "What?" "A lie." The words were gentle, but devastating. "A beautiful lie that someone is telling you because they want something from you, because no one could actually love someone like us too fat, too plain, too ordinary, too much, and not enough at the same time." The garden around them began to shift, reflecting the emotional turmoil of the conversation. Flowers wilted, paths cracked, the gentle sunlight dimmed to something grey and cold. "Look at him," the other Lyraleth continued, and suddenly Prince Khaemwaset was there, but not as Lyraleth had come to know him. This version was cruel, calculating, beautiful, in the way that predators are beautiful. Look at what he really is, a demon prince who needs a mortal bride to secure his claim to power. Do you really think someone like that could love someone like you for who you are? The phantom prince smiled, and it was a smile that held no warmth at all. "She serves her purpose," he said, in a voice like winter wind. "Useful for legitimizing my rule, controllable because of her desperate need for acceptance, the perfect puppet queen. And when he gets tired of playing house with a mortal pet," the other Lyraleth whispered, "what then? When the novelty wears off and he remembers that he's an immortal prince and you're just a fat girl who never learned to stop dreaming above her station." The illusion was perfect, devastating in its cruelty, precisely because it voiced every doubt Lyraleth had ever had about herself. Every cruel word she'd ever heard echoed in this garden of withering dreams, every moment of self-hatred given form and substance. And for a moment, just a moment, she almost believed it. Almost. But then she remembered something Prince Khaemwaset had said the night before. Recognizing the darkness in yourself and choosing light anyway is the most courageous thing anyone can do. "You're wrong," Lyraleth said quietly. "Am I?" The other version of herself leaned closer, eyes bright with malicious satisfaction. "Look around you. Look at what's happening to this place, just from you having doubts. How long do you think the beauty will last? When the magic realizes what you really are?" "You're wrong," Lyraleth repeated, louder this time. "Not about me having doubts. Those are real. Not about me being afraid. I am afraid. But you're wrong about what that means." She stood up from the bench, feeling power begin to flow through her again. Not the flashy magic of transformation, but something steadier, deep. "I am fat. I am ordinary in a lot of ways. I do have days when I can't believe any of this is real." The garden around them began to shift again, but this time toward life instead of decay. "But that doesn't make me worthless. It makes me human." The phantom Prince Khaemwaset flickered, his cruel smile wavering. And the man I love, the real Khaemwaset, doesn't love me in spite of my humanity. He loves me because of it. Because I bring something to his life that centuries of immortal perfection couldn't provide. What could you possibly bring to someone like him? The other Lyraleth added, but her voice was weaker now, less certain. Growth, change, the willingness to see problems from a mortal perspective. Lyraleth felt her confidence growing with each word. The ability to love someone, not because they're perfect, but because they're perfectly suited to who I am. The phantom prince laughed, but it sounded forced now. Pretty words, but when the novelty wears off, then we'll find new ways to grow together. Lyraleth interrupted. That's what love is. Not a static thing that burns bright and then fades, but a choice you make every day to see the best in someone and help them become it. The illusions were failing now, cracking like mirrors under pressure. Besides, Lyraleth added, with a smile that felt foreign and familiar all at once, you're operating from a flawed premise, which is that I need to be perfect to be worthy of love. She gestured to the garden, which was blooming again with flowers that looked like liquid starlight. But I've never been perfect. I've been exactly what I am, someone with flaws and fears and doubts, who chooses every day to try to be better anyway. And that's not worthless. That's human. That's beautiful. The other version of herself was fading now, becoming translucent. You still don't believe it, she said with her dying breath. Not completely. You still think you're not enough. You're right, Lyraleth admitted. I probably always will, at least a little bit. But that's okay. Doubt keeps you humble. Fear keeps you careful. The trick is not letting them paralyze you. And with that admission, the last of the illusions shattered. Lyraleth stood alone in a garden that was neither the withered wasteland of doubt nor the impossible paradise of delusion, but something in between, real, imperfect, beautiful in its mortality and its magic both. The assembled court had watched all of this in absolute silence, but now they erupted in applause that shook the very foundations of the Shadow Realm. But Lyraleth barely heard them. Her attention was fixed on the single figure walking toward her through the garden. Prince Khaemwaset, the real one this time. His expression was soft, with an emotion she was finally ready to recognize and accept. Love, not the desperate infatuation of someone settling for whatever they could get, but the steady, certain love of someone who had found their perfect complement. Hello, my queen, he said when he reached her. Queen? The trials are complete. His smile was brilliant, with joy and pride and promises. She was finally ready to believe. You've demonstrated power, wisdom, and most importantly, the kind of self-love that allows you to love others truly. He knelt before her in the garden, and when he looked up, his crimson eyes held the depth of centuries and the brightness of new beginnings. Lyraleth of the House Ravencrest, daughter of Elena the Shadow-Toast, princess of the Shadow Court, will you marry me? Not because of duty or debt or political necessity, but because you choose to, because you love me as much as I love you. And finally, Lyraleth was ready to say yes, without any doubt at all. Yes, always yes, forever yes. The garden exploded into life around them, flowers blooming in impossible colors, trees growing toward a sky that suddenly blazed with every star in the universe. And in that moment of perfect joy, Lyraleth understood what the trial of heart had really been about. Not proving that she could love others, but proving that she could accept being loved in return. She was worthy. She always had been. She just needed to believe it herself. Everything else would follow from there. Some ceremonies change your legal status. Others transform your entire existence. The trick is knowing which kind you're walking into. The wedding began 3 days later, at the moment when all 3 moons of the Shadow Realm aligned in perfect conjunction, an event that occurred once every 100 years and was considered the most auspicious time for binding souls across dimensions. Lyraleth woke that morning in chambers that had transformed overnight into something beyond her wildest dreams. The walls were draped in silk, that captured and held starlight, creating a gentle glow that made everything look touched by magic. Flowers that existed only in songs and stories filled the air with fragrances that could induce euphoria in mortals, but only brought peace to those with fey blood. And her wedding dress, it wasn't a dress at all, she realized as she touched the creation, hanging from what looked like crystallized moonbeams. It was a work of art, a poem made manifest, a symphony played in fabric and light. The base was silk so fine it felt like wearing water, in a shade of deep purple that shifted to silver in the light. But woven through that silk were threads of actual starlight, creating patterns that moved and changed as she watched constellations that told the story of her journey from the mortal realm to this moment of transformation. The neckline was designed to celebrate her décolletage rather than hide it, with silver embroidery that drew the eye to the beauty of her form. The skirt flowed around her like liquid night, cut to move with her body rather than despite it. And the sleeves were gossamer wings that would allow her magic to flow freely while looking like she was dressed in captured dreams. "Beautiful," came a voice from the doorway. Lyraleth turned to find Lady Seraphine entering, her butterfly wings shimmering with colors that had no names in any mortal language. "I brought you something," the older fae continued, holding out a small velvet box. "A gift from your grandmother, from Elena, but she's been dead for decades. Time works differently for objects touched by deep magic." Lady Seraphine opened the box to reveal a necklace that took Lyraleth's breath away. It was a single pendant, a stone that looked like captured shadow, surrounded by silver, that moved like living vines. "She left this for the day you would claim your heritage, said you'd know when that day came." The moment the necklace touched her throat, Lyraleth felt the last piece of her transformation fall into place. Power flooded through her, not new magic, but the full awakening of everything that had been sleeping in her blood since birth. She was no longer partially fae, no longer caught between worlds. She was herself, complete and whole, and magnificent. "Now you're ready," Lady Seraphine said with satisfaction. "Shall we?" The wedding ceremony itself defied every convention Lyraleth had ever learned about such events. To begin with, it was held not in a church or great hall, but in a clearing that existed simultaneously in the shadow realm and the mortal world, a place where the barriers between dimensions were thin enough that guests from both sides could attend. And what guests they were! The fae contingent alone would have been enough to overwhelm any mortal observer. Demons whose beauty could drive humans mad, spirits that looked like living aurora, creatures that existed in too many dimensions for mortal minds to fully comprehend. They filled the air itself, some hovering on wings of light, others seated on furniture that grew from the ground at their approach. But they weren't the only attendees. To Lyraleth's amazement, mortals had come as well. Not from her family. She'd made it clear that House Ravencrest was no longer welcome in her life. But others, people whose lives she'd touched without realizing it. Servants from the manor who had seen past her family's cruel words to the kindness underneath. Scholars who had corresponded with her grandmother and wanted to witness the fulfillment of Elena's bloodline. Even the village healer who had once told her she had gifted hands was there, looking overwhelmed, but determined to see the girl she'd encouraged become a queen. "They came to witness history," Prince Khaemwaset murmured as he appeared beside her in clothing that managed to be both regal and somehow modest, deep black silk that emphasized his otherworldly beauty without overwhelming her on her day. History, the first binding between the Shadow Court and mortal realm in 3 centuries, the first queen of mixed blood to claim the throne, the first time the barriers between worlds have been opened for celebration instead of war. The ceremony itself was unlike anything from either world. There was no priest or officiant in the traditional sense. Instead, the magic itself served as witness and guide, responding to their intentions and the depth of their commitment. Ancient words in languages that predated human civilization, mixed with vows spoken in common tongue, so that every guest could understand their promises. "I bind my magic to yours," Prince Khaemwaset spoke first. his voice carrying clearly across the impossible caring, not to diminish either, but to create something greater than the sum of our parts. I bind my heart to yours, Lyraleth responded, feeling power pulse between them with each word, not to lose myself, but to become the person I was always meant to be. The magic responded to their vows by weaving visible connections between them, threads of light that sparkled with every color in the spectrum, and several that existed only in dimensions mortals couldn't perceive. But these weren't chains that bound them together against their will. They were bridges that allowed them to share strength without sacrificing independence. When the formal ceremony ended and the celebration began, Lyraleth finally had a chance to understand what it meant to be celebrated rather than tolerated. Supernatural beings, who could have destroyed armies with their casual thoughts, congratulated her with genuine warmth. Mortals, who had never seen real magic, watched in wonder as she laughed and danced and created spontaneous gardens with the overflow of her joy. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. But it was during the quieter moments, when she and her new husband stole away from the celebration to catch their breath, that the full magnitude of what had happened really hit her. "We're married," she said, marveling at how the words sounded. "We are indeed, my queen." His smile was soft with contentment and bright with anticipation.
How does it feel?
Lyraleth considered the question seriously. How did it feel to be married to a demon prince? To be queen of a realm that existed in the spaces between dreams and nightmares? To have gone from unwanted daughter to supernatural royalty in the space of a week? Like coming home, she said finally. Like everything that came before was just preparation for this moment. And as they rejoined the celebration, the beginning, the promise of forever, Lyraleth realized that for the first time in her life, she had no desire to be anyone other than exactly who she was. She was Lyraleth, queen of the Shadow Court, bridge between worlds, living proof that love could indeed conquer all, starting with the conquest of self-doubt, and her story was just beginning. They say the first year of marriage is the hardest. They clearly never married a demon prince and inherited a realm. Queen Lyraleth stood on the balcony of what was now officially called the Palace of Two Worlds, looking out over a vista that would have been impossible to imagine just 13 months ago. The Shadow Realm had changed under her influence, not dramatically, but in subtle ways that accumulated into transformation. Gardens now grew in spaces that had been barren for millennia, tended by beings who had rediscovered the joy of creation. Trade routes had been established between the supernatural and mortal realms, bringing prosperity to both sides. The rigid hierarchies that had defined fair society for centuries were slowly giving way to something more flexible, more just, and she had changed too. The woman who looked back at her from enchanted mirrors now bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had been bartered away by her father, not just in appearance, though the fair transformation had been remarkable, but in presence, confidence, the quiet certainty of someone who had found their place in the universe and intended to defend it. "Admiring your handiwork," came a familiar voice from behind her. She turned to find King Khaemwaset approaching with the easy grace that had first caught her attention. He'd grown into his new role as well, becoming less the remote immortal prince and more a partner who understood that true power came from lifting others up rather than keeping them down. "Hardly just mine," she replied, settling into his embrace with the comfort of perfect familiarity. "I seem to recall having some help. Perhaps a little." His lips found the spot just below her ear that never failed to make her shiver. "You've exceeded even my wildest expectations, my love." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their impossible realm go about its evening routines. It hadn't been easy, this first year of marriage and joint rule. There had been political challenges from nobles who resented a mortal-born queen, diplomatic crises with neighboring realms, the thousand small difficulties of merging two very different approaches to governance. But they had faced each challenge together, and somehow that had made even the worst problems seem manageable. "Any regrets?" Khaemwaset asked softly. Lyraleth considered the question seriously, Did she miss anything about her old life? The simplicity of having no responsibilities beyond her own survival, the certainty that came with low expectations. Only one, she said finally. Oh, I regret that it took me 24 years to realize I was already exactly who I was supposed to be. Everything else, the magic, the crown, even you, was just the universe finally catching up to what was always true. His answering smile was brilliant, with love and something deeper, recognition of the woman she'd become, and anticipation of who she was, still becoming. Speaking of which, he murmured, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you. What's that? Lady Seraphine mentioned that several of the mortal villages near the dimensional barriers have been having problems with magical incursions. Nothing dangerous, but enough to be disruptive. They've requested help from someone who understands both worlds. Lyraleth felt a familiar stirring of excitement at the prospect of a new challenge. When do we leave? Did you really think I was going to let you have all the fun of playing interdimensional diplomat? She grinned at his expression. Besides, I'm curious to see how mortals react to their former fat, useless noble girl returning as an actual queen. His laughter was everything she'd never dared to dream of. Pure joy, perfect understanding, the sound of a partner who loved her, not despite her ambitions, but because of them. As you wish, my queen, though I should warn you, I suspect this is going to be more complicated than it appears. The best adventures always are, Lyraleth replied, already planning their approach to what sounded like it might be the beginning of their next great story. And as the 3 moons of the Shadow Realm rose over their impossible kingdom, Queen Lyraleth allowed herself a moment of perfect satisfaction. She was exactly who she was supposed to be, exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the partner she was supposed to have. Everything else was just details.